The morning they announced, I would marry Princess Serevith of the Velketh Dominion. I was elbow-deep in a drainage conduit on level 4 of Outpost Marin, and my commanding officer had to say it twice before I looked up. Pete, that. Senior Commander Aldrich Voss stood at the mouth of the conduit, his boots clean, his expression carrying the particular flatness of a man delivering news he finds professionally inconvenient. The Consolidated Accords, Article 11, Subsection 40, Political Bonding Clause. The Dominion requires a human co-signatory to validate the treaty. You were selected. By who? The selection algorithm. You have a clean record, frontier fluency in 2 Dominion dialects, and no family entanglements that would complicate the arrangement. He cleared his throat. And you happen to be available. I looked down at the conduit. I'm in the middle of something. Kel, I'm going to finish the conduit. I finished the conduit. Then I washed my hands, reported to the briefing room, and sat quietly while 3 separate diplomatic liaisons explained to me, in careful and increasingly slow language, that I had not been asked. Article 11 was not an invitation. It was a designation. The Consolidated Accords, signed 12 years ago in the aftermath of the KL-9 engagement, had embedded this provision precisely for situations like this. Situations where a formal human dominion alliance required a living, breathing human signature to carry legal weight under galactic compact law. That human signature was a person. The person was me. You'll be compensated, one of the liaisons said. He had the look of a man who found his own job embarrassing. Quite generously. I don't want compensation. Then, what do you want? I thought about it for a moment. Outside the briefing room windows, the pale light of Marin's binary stars lay flat and white across the landing pad. 2 supply ships were being unloaded. A crew hand I recognized was arguing with a cargo drone. The ordinary work of the ordinary world. To finish the current tour, I said. Reassignment to the Dominion, post after that. Keep my rank and clearances. They agreed immediately, which told me I had asked for too little. I didn't go back to change the terms. I was not, by nature or inclination, a man who spent much energy calculating what he was owed. I met Serevith 6 weeks before the ceremony, at a formal pre-accord reception on Velketh Prime, in a hall so large that the ceiling disappeared into a kind of engineered mist, and the other end of the room was a theoretical concept. I had been dressed by 3 Dominion attendants who regarded my proportions with the quiet distress of artists given substandard materials. And I had been briefed on 17 protocols, 12 modes of address, and 4 specific, physical gestures that were either deeply respectful or deeply offensive depending on the context, none of which I was confident I had properly distinguished. I was standing near a column, holding a glass of something pale and mildly effervescent when she appeared. She was not what I had been told to expect. The briefing documents had described Princess Serevith, in the dry language of diplomatic inventory, 3rd daughter of the Dominion sovereign, age 28 by their calendar. Status: eligible. The document had not mentioned that she moved through a room the way a weather system moves through an open plain, not dramatically, not with any effort at display, but with the quiet authority of something that simply is. She was tall for Velketh, gold-bronze skin, the kind that caught light differently at every angle, as though the surface of her had its own opinion about illumination. Dark, copper-red hair arranged in the formal Dominion style, pinned back with clasps of hammered silver. Pale gold eyes that were, at the moment they found mine across the hall, carrying the same expression I suspected mine were carrying. Pure professional reserve. We were introduced by a court chamberlain who managed to make both our names sound like items on an inventory list. We exchanged the appropriate formalities. I used 3 of the 17 protocols. She responded to each one with the measured courtesy of someone who had memorized far more than 17 protocols and was now executing them with the efficiency of a person who has learned to survive formality. Soldier Kel, she said. Her voice was lower than I had expected. Not soft, not musical, simply measured. A voice that chose its words. Says Serevith. I'm told this arrangement was not your choice. I'm told the same about yours. Something shifted, slightly behind her eyes. Not warmth, exactly. More like the faint recalibration of someone who had expected a different kind of answer. That is accurate, she said. Then we have something in common. Another recalibration. She tilted her head a fraction, the way Velketh often do when they are assessing, rather than reacting. We have very little else. That's probably true, I agreed. Common ground is common ground. She held my gaze for a moment longer than protocol required. Then she said, precisely, I will try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be, Soldier Kell. Same, I said. And Davin is fine. If you want to use it. She did not use it that evening, but she remembered it. The ceremony was a Dominion affair. I stood where I was told to stand, said what I was told to say, and pressed my hand against the accord tablet at the moment I was told to press it. The light that ran through the inscription grooves when both our hands were on the tablet simultaneously was a deep, resonant amber, the Velketh shade for sealed bonds, and the hall made a sound I had no translation for, something between a held breath and a chord. Afterward, at the reception, I was placed in a chair to Saravith's left and introduced to several hundred Dominion nobles, court officials, and diplomatic delegations, almost none of whom seemed to know what to do with me. I was not, to be direct, a natural fit in a Velketh court. I was 34 years old, and had spent the previous 12 years of my life in frontier postings, on ships, and in exactly the kind of assignments that leave a person better acquainted with drainage conduits than with formal reception halls. I had a scar along my jaw from a debris strike at KL-9. One crooked finger on my left hand from a re-reap break that healed wrong on a vessel without a proper medical bay, and the kind of face that looks, in formal attire, as though it is waiting for the formal attire to end. Court noticed all of this. I understood. Within the first hour of that reception, the particular way a large social body communicates its opinion of a person without ever addressing that person directly. The glances that landed and then lifted away as though the eye had touched something slightly incorrect. The conversations that started near me and then moved incrementally a half step away. The titles used by the Chamberlain when he announced me to delegations. Accord-bonded consort, rather than the Velketh marital. Honorific that Saravith's other titled relatives received with their introductions. Saravith received it all with the composed stillness of a woman who had been raised to notice everything and display nothing. I watched her across the table during the formal dinner. The way she answered questions, the way her hands lay still in her lap during the speeches, the way she sometimes looked at me with an expression I was beginning to learn. It was not kindness, exactly, it was attention. The particular quality of being seen without being evaluated. I was not used to that distinction, and I did not know, in those early weeks, what to do with it. Former suitor arrived 3 months after the ceremony aboard the Thorin diplomatic convoy that docked at Velketh Prime for the annual Dominion Trade Summit. His name was Warlord Sitharin Vel Thuris, and he entered every room with the particular confidence of a man who has been told since birth that rooms exist for him to enter. He was large by Velketh standards, nearly my height, which was unusual, with the formal bearing of a military family and the kind of face that Dominion portrait painters probably enjoyed. He had, I was told in quiet side notes from the court translator, proposed to Saravith twice before the accord was signed, and been declined twice. He introduced himself to me on the second day of the summit, in the east corridor, outside the primary deliberation chamber, with a handshake that was calibrated about 10% firmer than courtesy required. Bonded consort Kell, he said, not Devon, not soldier. The title was correct and precise and carried in the way he placed it, the faint weight of quotation marks. Warlord Vel Thuras, I said. Heard a great deal about you, he said it. The way people say things they want you to hear are untrue. None of it recent, I said. I've been quiet the past few years. Yes, he said. Frontier posts, I understand. Very remote. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who has found exactly what he expected and is satisfied by the confirmation. How are you finding court life, Consort Kell? Quieter than the frontier, I said. More conduits. He didn't understand the reference, which was fine. He hadn't been meant to. We parted with the correct number of polite words, and I went back to watching the deliberation chamber intake for the afternoon session. What I did not do, which I understand surprised several people who were watching, was match his posture, or elevate my voice, or give any sign that I had read the conversation the way it had been written. I had been in enough tight situations to know that the man who escalates in a corridor gives up the ground before the actual contest begins. Setharon Veltharas was testing weight and distribution, the way you test a structure before you decide where to apply pressure. I had given him nothing to calculate. He recalibrated. And then he chose a different approach. I had learned, in the months between the ceremony and the summit, what it meant to live inside a social structure that has already decided what you are. The Velketh court was not cruel about it. That would have required a kind of engagement it didn't extend. It simply operated around me with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a system that has placed an unfamiliar object on its desk and learned to work around it without examining the object too carefully. I was given apartments, an allowance of court time, access to the secondary libraries, and an honorific that technically conveyed standing, but practically conveyed the court's polite uncertainty about how much standing. I attended the formal functions I was required to attend. I wore the correct attire. I observed the 17 protocols with the care of a man who has learned that the protocols are not arbitrary. They encode something real about how the Velketh holds space and respect, and the distance between people, and I did not make the mistake of dismissing them, simply because I had not grown up with them. I was also, in the quieter hours, methodically learning the court. Not politically, I had neither the interest nor the apparatus for court politics, but as a structure of people. After 12 years on frontier postings, I had a reasonable facility for reading environments, and a court is an environment like any other. It has load-bearing walls and vulnerable corners, and the particular fault lines that appear in any human or alien social system where power is concentrated and scrutinized simultaneously. What I learned over those months was that the people in this court who mattered most were not always the ones with the most visible position. Court translator, Velashan, knew every conversation in every corridor. The Chamberlain's secondary assistant, who had worked for 4 different house primaries, and appeared to be roughly 300 years old by Velketh reckoning, had a memory for precedent that made the formal record look sparse. The 2 senior officers of Saraveth's personal household staff, quiet, watchful women named Velthres and Velaman, ran the actual functioning of the royal apartments with a brisk efficiency that the formal protocols only partially described. I made a point of learning their names early and using them correctly. Sareveth noticed that. She mentioned it one evening, in passing. "The household staff have a different opinion of you than the court does," she said. We were walking through the lower corridor, after a formal dinner. A brief private moment between one obligation and the next, and her voice was pitched at the level of a private observation rather than a conversation. "I wasn't trying to produce an opinion," I said. "I know," she said. "That's likely why they have one." She did not elaborate, and I did not ask, but I held it. The approach, as it turned out, was the floor of the deliberation chamber itself. The Dominion Trade Summit, in its 4th day, opened a secondary session for the ratification of Frontier Compact amendments. Specifically, the KL-9 Accord Supplemental, which touched directly on human Dominion military coordination protocols. It was the part of the summit that most of the attending delegations found procedurally routine, and the chamber had taken on the slightly distracted air of a large body going through necessary motions. Setharon Veltharas had requested speaking time. I was in the second gallery, seated with the non-voting observer delegations, which was where accord-bonded consorts without portfolio were placed by Dominion protocol. Saraveth was on the floor below at the Velketh primary table. She sat with the composed stillness I had come to recognize. I watched her hands still in her lap. I watched the back of her head. I did not watch Setharon at first, because I did not need to. He began conventionally. The KL-9 Supplemental, the Frontier Compact Amendments, the procedural technicalities of coordination protocols. His argument was competent. He was, I admitted to myself without resentment, a skilled speaker, his voice carrying the kind of formal authority that the Velketh training system clearly spent considerable effort developing. He made his primary case in 9 minutes, and then, with the smooth transition of a man who has planned the pivot, he turned to the question of the accord itself. "The consolidated accords," he said, "were built on a principle of mutual representation. The human co-signatory provision of Article 11 was intended to ensure that the human compact would be represented by a figure of commensurate standing. He paused. In the chamber, pauses are deliberate tools. Current accord-bonded consort of the Velketh House primary was selected, as I understand it, by designation algorithm from available frontier-stationed personnel. He said, frontier-stationed, the way you say adequate but not preferred. I raise this not as a personal objection, he continued. And of course he did, because that is what people say when it is entirely personal, but as a procedural concern. The supplemental amendments before this chamber today will carry the weight of the Accord's human co-signatory. The question of whether that co-signatory represents an appropriate counterpart to the Velketh House primary is, I would argue, a question this chamber has an obligation to address. Silence in the room. The careful, attended silence of 200 diplomats calculating where this is going. I watched Saravith's hands. They had not moved. Setharan let the silence settle, then continued. I have reviewed the service record of Accord-bonded consort Kel. It is adequate. 12 years of frontier postings, maintenance and logistics assignments predominating. No command history. No distinction above the standard frontier posting grade. No recorded engagements. Another pause. This chamber is being asked to ratify amendments to one of the most significant human dominion compacts in the last 2 decades. I am asking only that we consider whether the human signature on those amendments carries appropriate weight. He sat down. The chamber produced the precise sound of 200 people deciding whether to speak. I was looking at the gallery railing in front of me. The wood, it was wood, true Velketh heartwood, dark and dense, and slightly warm to the touch, had been polished so many times that I could see my own reflection in it, dim and shadowed. I looked at that reflection for a moment, and I thought about a few things. I thought about the KL-9 engagement 12 years ago. I thought about a certain set of operational records that had been filed under a classification grade, I had been told, at the time, would not likely be reviewed for 30 years. I thought about the 3 specific reasons those records had been classified at that grade, and about whether any of those reasons remained applicable. The Accord Observer Protocol permitted gallery members to request floor time during supplemental sessions. It was a rarely used provision. I raised my hand. Chamber Chair, a senior Dominion arbitrator named Vel Casson, looked up from her console with the expression of someone who has just been handed an unexpected administrative problem. She confirmed the request, confirmed my status, and, with the slightly resigned authority of a woman who has upheld every protocol in her career and was not about to stop now, granted the floor. I came down from the gallery. I walked to the floor speaker's position. 200 faces turned in my direction with varying mixtures of curiosity, skepticism, and the particular expression that the Velketh court had, by this point, trained on me like a small recurring weather event. I noticed, as I reached the speaker's position, that several of the senior court officials in the first-tier seating had straightened incrementally in their chairs. Not in response to my arrival, exactly, but in the way that large formal bodies sometimes straighten before something occurs that they have not yet identified. I noticed also that Saravith had turned slightly at the Velketh primary table.
Not toward me.
She was facing the chamber floor, the correct protocol position. The angle of her shoulders had changed. She was listening differently. I looked at Setharan Veltharas. He met my gaze with the composed patience of a man who has already won and is waiting for the formality to conclude. I turned back to the chamber. Warlord Veltharas states that my record shows no recorded engagements, I said. That is accurate. The engagement I am about to describe was classified at Tier 7 by Mutual Dominion Human Compact Security Agreement at the time of its conclusion. I am going to request through the chamber chair an immediate provisional declassification of my personal operational record under Accord Transparency Protocol, Article 6. If Arbitrator Velkassin confirms the protocol, I'll proceed. Velkassin looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized. Not skepticism exactly, but the careful face of someone recalculating a situation. She confirmed the protocol. The amber light on her console shifted to white. Thank you, I said. I looked at the chamber. 12 years ago, during the KL-9 engagement, The Dominion's sixth frontier line collapsed under the Harith advance. The collapse was significant. The Harith broke through approximately 40 kilometers of defensive coordinate, and the civilian population of 3 secondary Dominion settlements in that corridor was directly in the advance path. The Dominion Emergency Response Fleet was 17 hours out. Human compact frontier assets in the area consisted of 1 scout vessel, the CS Marin 6, crew of 8, myself included. 200 people were very quiet. The Harith advance used an armament classification that the Dominion had not yet documented. A pulse cascade system that could disable shield architecture at range before conventional engagement protocols could be initiated. The Marin 6 did not have adequate counter-architecture. What it had was a crew that could move fast and improvise under pressure. I paused, not for effect, but because the next part was specific and I wanted to be precise. We ran the Harith convoy through a debris field, 17 passes. We took structural damage on the 4th pass and lost propulsion on the 14th. We completed the remaining 3 passes on emergency auxiliary power. The Harith advance was disrupted for 19 hours. The Dominion Emergency Response Fleet arrived inside that window. I let that settle. The civilian population of the 3 settlements was evacuated. Total, 43,218 individuals. I looked at the chamber. I don't carry those numbers because I find them impressive. I carry them because it took 19 hours and those are the hours that mattered. Another pause. Turned to look directly at Sethran Velthuras. He was still in his seat. His expression had not collapsed. He was too trained for that. But the composed patience had been replaced by something more careful and harder to read. The warlord asked whether the human signature on these amendments carries appropriate weight. I said, I am not in a position to answer that question for the chamber. What I can tell you is that the 43,000 individuals in those 3 settlements were Velketh, and that the weight of the human compact, as I have understood it and carried it for 12 years, has never depended on whether it was recognized. I walked back to the gallery. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of shock. Velketh formal bodies do not produce shock in the obvious way, the way a human room would fill with noise and exclamation. It was the quiet of 200 practiced minds adjusting to a new weight of information. I sat back down in the gallery. I put my hands on my knees. I looked at the heartwood railing. Below, in the chamber, I could hear the sound of the floor reconvening. Traitor Velkassen's voice, steady and precise, moving the session back into procedural order. Several of the first-tier delegations were having the low, quick conversations that large formal bodies have when they are recalculating something they thought was settled. Sethran Velthuras had not moved from his seat. His 2 aides flanked him with the careful stillness of people waiting to be told what expression to wear. I did not look at Sethran. I looked at the back of Saravith's head. She had not turned. She was sitting very still, the way she sat when she was doing her most careful thinking. Not tense, just present. The kind of presence that exists in the body before it becomes visible anywhere else. The angle of her shoulders was different from before. Something in her posture had changed. When I walked back up to the gallery, though I could not have named precisely what, only that she was holding herself with the quality of a person who has received something they need to examine carefully before they know what to do with it. Arbitrator Velkassan proceeded with the session. The supplemental amendments were ratified without further objection. The procedural record noted the provisional declassification. The session concluded in appropriate order, and the chamber's 200 bodies rose and moved toward the exits, with the particular controlled motion of a formal body dispersing. Unhurried, quiet, the conversations beginning only once a certain physical distance from the chamber floor had been established. I stayed in the gallery until most of them had gone. Then I came down and went through the side corridor to the windows. I stood by the windows that looked out over the Velketh Prime capital. The stacked architecture of it, the pale stone towers in the late afternoon light, the slow movement of transit platforms between the levels. I was looking at a cargo platform when I heard steps behind me and turned to find the court translator, a small and meticulous woman named Vela Shan, standing at a careful distance with an expression I had not seen from her before. Consort Kel, she said. Then she stopped. Then she said, in Velketh, the household designation I had heard once before at the formal ceremony and not since. The one that means, in the old form, the one who acts in the absence of record. I did not know what to say to that. So I said nothing, which seemed to be acceptable. Saturday evening in the small side room, adjacent to the formal apartments where I had taken to spending the hours between obligations, because it had a window that faced west, and the binary star's light came through it in the late hours, in a way that was good for thinking. I had a cup of something warm, one of the Velketh infusions that I had learned to find acceptable, though I would not have called it enjoyable. And I was sitting in the chair by the window doing nothing in particular. She came in without announcing herself, which was the first time she had done that. She stood near the doorway for a moment, and I waited. You knew, she said. Not an accusation, an observation. You knew what was in the classified record before today. Yes, you've known since before the ceremony. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. She moved to the window. Not next to me, she stopped a few feet away, looking out at the same late western light. I noticed that she was not carrying herself in the formal court posture she used in public spaces. Shoulders were different. Her hands were at her sides, not clasped. You didn't use it, she said. Shh. In the 3 months since the ceremony, there were moments when you could have. I know. Why didn't you? I thought about it seriously, because she was asking seriously, and she deserved a serious answer. Because it wasn't relevant, I said finally. The record exists. It doesn't need to be announced to be true. What I did at KL9 happened whether or not this court knows about it. She turned from the window and looked at me. Pale gold of her eyes in that light was something I had no vocabulary for and did not try to manufacture one. She was looking at me the way she looked at things she was deciding how to hold. With the full attention of someone who does not look without meaning to. Seth Aran was testing you, she said. I know. You understood that from the beginning. Yes, and you waited until there was something worth saying. She held my gaze. Most people do not wait that long. Most people are trying to win the conversation, I said. Shh. I was trying to answer the question. There was a quiet between us that was different from the polite quiets of the previous 3 months. Not comfortable exactly. Comfort was probably not the right word for where we were, but real. The kind of quiet that exists when two people have stopped performing for each other, at least for the moment. I didn't know about KL9, she said, the classified record. I had access to your summary service file, not the Tier 7 designation. I didn't assume you had, I would have. I want you to know that I would have asked to see it. If I had known the Tier 7 existed. She looked at me steadily. I am trying to tell you that I would not have remained ignorant by choice. Something in my chest shifted, which I had not expected. I know that, I said. I've had 3 months to watch how you pay attention to things. You pay attention carefully. She looked at me for another long moment. And then she did something I had not seen from her before. She let her expression do what it was trying to do, without managing it. It was not warmth in the easy sense of the word, and it was not recognition in any dramatic sense. It was more like the look a person gives when they have been trying to determine whether something is real, and have arrived at a conclusion. Devon, she said, using my name for the first time since the reception. Yes, I find that I have been incorrect, she said, about the nature of this arrangement. I waited. I believed it was a political formality, she continued. A structure without interiority. I was managing it on that basis. She looked at the window briefly, then back at me. I was wrong. About which part? About the interiority. I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the binary stars had dropped below the horizon on one side, and the remaining light was a long, deep gold across the stone of the Capitol below. I wasn't managing it, I said. I don't know how to do that kind of thing. I was just present. Yes, she said. Another quiet. This one settled differently. Longer. The session record, she said finally. The chamber will formally note the declassification. The warlord's procedural challenge will be listed as withdrawn. I assumed he won't attempt the same approach again. No, I agreed. He'll find a different one eventually. People like that usually do. She nodded. She was not dismissing this, I noticed. She was filing it. Adding it to whatever internal ledger she maintained for the future. I had the sense, in that moment, that she was a great deal more prepared for the future than anyone in that chamber had been giving her credit for, including possibly me. "Wilt you tell me," she said quietly, "about Kale 9? Not the official record. Part that's." Underneath it, I looked at her. "It's not a pleasant story, I'm aware." She held my gaze. "I want to hear it anyway." So I told her. I told her about Marin 6 and the 8-person crew, and what the Hareth Pulse Coastcast looked like on the sensor array when you're running a debris field on your 4th pass and already taking damage. The debris field had been the idea of our navigator, a woman named Cease, who'd been calculating vectors in her head since she was old enough to walk. And her theory was that if we couldn't outfight the Harath convoy, we could outconfuse it. Make ourselves unpredictable enough, fast enough, close enough to the debris mass that the pulse cascade couldn't lock a clean firing solution without risking their own ships. It was a reasonable theory. It was also, as she acknowledged on our 2nd pass, a theory that assumed we could tolerate damage faster than they could adapt. Could. Barely. Told her. About the engineering arguments we had between passes, in the 10-minute windows when the crew chief was trying to hold the secondary propulsion together with increasingly creative solutions. His name was Aldrin Cross, and he had the quality of a man who is at his best when the options are fewest. Not calm exactly, but focused with a clarity that had nothing to prove, no time for it. On the 7th pass, he found a routing configuration through the tertiary systems that bought us another 3 runs before the primary propulsion began to strain. On the 11th pass, he told me, without drama, that we had maybe 4 passes left before the propulsion architecture would fail in ways that couldn't be reversed mid-flight. I told her about the 14th pass, when we lost main propulsion entirely, and the 3 remaining passes after that on what the crew chief described, with accurate professionalism, as hope and residual momentum. What he meant, technically, was that we were using the gravitational interaction with the debris field itself to curve our trajectory on each run, coasting on physics in lieu of thrust. Cease was running the calculations by hand at that point. Because the navigational computer had taken a hit on pass 12, and the backup systems were operating on a reduced instruction set, she ran them correctly, all 3 times. I told her about the 19 hours, the watch we kept after the final pass, sitting on a half-dead ship in a debris field with no propulsion and a Hareth convoy that had, to our considerable relief, decided that the cost of pursuing us into the debris mass was higher than waiting us out. They waited. We waited longer. The Dominion response fleet appeared on sensors at hour 19 and 4 minutes, and the sound the ship made was the sound of 7 people exhaling at the same moment. I told her about the crew, their names, what they were doing now, the ones I still had contact with. Cease was teaching navigation at a compact academy on the 4th rim, had retired from the service, and was running a small engineering consultancy somewhere on the 2nd belt, near his family. The others were scattered. Frontier work tends to scatter people, send them into the next assignment before the last one has fully settled. Told her about Reth Callan, propulsion engineer, 26 years old. He had been on pass 14, in the engine compartment when the main propulsion failed. The failure itself was not what killed him. It was the secondary surge that followed the failure. A power cascade through the compartment that the shielding should have contained and didn't. Tross found him in the compartment after the pass and told me in the corridor outside with the particular brevity of a man who has been a soldier long enough to know that brevity is sometimes the only mercy available. Callan had been the one who found the tertiary routing on pass 7. Cross had been trying to solve it for 40 minutes. Callan had looked at the system diagram for 90 seconds and said quietly, "I think I see it." She listens to all of it without interruption. She was very good at listening, the kind of listening that isn't waiting for its turn, but is actually receiving what's being said, processing it, holding it as it is. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "His name," she said, "the one who wasn't. Reth Callan, propulsion engineer, 26 years old." She held that. Then, "I will ask the formal record office to note his name in the declassified citation." I had not expected that. I looked at her, and she was looking at me, and I understood then that she had been from before the ceremony, from the very first reception and the very first exchange of formal words, paying the same quality of attention to everything around her that I had been paying to her. She had been doing this whole time what I had been doing. Watching. Waiting for something worth saying. "Thank you," I said. "It's the appropriate thing," she said. And then, quietly, "It is also the right thing." The summit concluded 2 days later. Seth Ofrin Vel Theras departed with his convoy on the third morning, after the standard formal departure proceedings, and I stood in the correct position at the correct distance during the farewell protocol and said the appropriate words. He met my gaze once, briefly, at the end of the ceremony. His expression was controlled and correct. Mine was, I imagine, the same. Then he was gone, and the east landing pad was quiet in the morning light, and I stood there for a moment in the good empty air before the next obligation began. Court had changed after the chamber session. Not dramatically. The Velketh court was not the kind of social body that changed dramatically, in visible and declared ways. It changed the way a room changes when a window is opened. The same air, slightly different pressure. The glances that landed on me were different. Some of them held. Some of the noble families who had previously engaged me only in the minimum necessary protocol began, in the following days, to engage me in the optional kind. The Chamberlain used the correct Velketh, marital honorific, when he introduced me to delegations without being asked. I did not make much of any of this, because it seemed to me that the same work had been just work regardless of whether anyone was watching. And the only thing that had changed was the watching. But I noticed, in the way that a person trained by 12 years of frontier, posting to notice changes in the environment, notices things. The temperature of the room had shifted. Velashan, the court translator, stopped me in the corridor on the 4th day after the summit and said, again in the old form of the household designation, a longer version of what she had said before. I asked her to translate it for me, because my old form Velketh was not strong enough to catch every nuance. She translated it slowly, carefully, the way she translated things she wanted to get exactly right. It meant, approximately, the one who acts before speaking, and whose acts require no revision. I thanked her. She gave me a short, precise bow of the kind I had not been given before by court staff, and went back to her work. 3 weeks after the summit, Serevith came to the side room again. This time she brought her own cup of something warm, and she sat in the chair across from mine. Not the chair beside it, not the careful distance of the first conversation, but opposite. So we were facing each other in the late western light. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the court, not about the accord, not about Setharon, or the chamber, or the classified record. We talked about the things that were underneath all of that, about the frontier, and what 12 years of it does to a person, not badly, necessarily, but permanently. There are certain adjustments to the interior that don't adjust back, about the Velketh training system, and what it does to the interior of a person who goes through it. The particular quality of composure it produces, and the things it teaches a person to manage that perhaps should not always be managed. About the binary stars and why she had always found the late western light something worth sitting with. She told me about the 2 refusals she had given Sethoron, and why. Not bitterness, simply clarity. She had known, she said, from the first proposal, that he was offering her the performance of a partnership, the exterior of it, the correct form, the impressive detail, without the interior. She had understood that she was not looking for this impressive detail. She had not known at the time of the second refusal what she was looking for. And now, I said. She looked at me for a moment across the space between the chairs. The pale gold of her eyes was doing the thing it did in this light, and I had decided some time ago to simply let it do that without trying to put language to it. Something with interiority, she said. I sat with that for a moment. That's a high standard. Yes, she agreed. I've always been told it was too high. It isn't. She held my gaze. No, she said quietly. I've recently had confirmation of that. We sat for a while longer in the western light, saying less and less as the light deepened toward the Velketh evening, and what was between us was not declared or made formal in any way that the court protocols would have recognized. It was simply there. The way things are there. When they have been quietly growing for a while and have finally stopped needing to pretend otherwise. I thought about what the translator had said. The one who acts before speaking, and whose acts require no revision. I was not a man given to pride in the ordinary sense. I sat in that chair, in the good fading light, and understood, with the kind of quiet certainty that replaces the need for further argument, that I had been present the whole time. For the work, for the watch, for the 19 hours, and for this, and that being present was all it had ever been, and it had always been exactly enough. Saravith looked at the window. I looked at her, and the light for a long time was enough for both of us.